the online world is it's amazing and it's also terrifying, but there's so much on there that I think churches haven't utilized, and there probably haven't been enough people to come up and be the first to create a lot of the tools that churches need to see, or strategies. I think strategy is probably the big word here.
Yeah, I think and what informs strategy is knowledge of the demographics, and this is the least religious, the most online, one of the most lonely generations we've seen. And so there is that call to churches to bring people in. And I think the strategy has been offering more online options, trying to make things more accessible, but that doesn't really get to the root need of community. Like, sure, that's kind of meeting people where they are, but even you and I feel this need that church isn't as focused on small community groups. Like our church is really great at forming small groups and having that consistency, but there isn't always the sense of community, especially in a larger church or in a church that isn't able to meet as consistently. Like, it's hard to have that place where you can show up every week. And I think especially Gen Z, like, they had this whole COVID interrupt their education. They're like very lonely, trying to find connection online. I think they need a consistent place where they can go and where they can show up and they know that it's going to be there. Like, I think it's a lot to ask them to build it on the way or kind of show up to something that's kind of there. Like, I think they need that consistency and somewhere where they know and are confident that they're welcomed and that they can grow.
Yeah, I'm really glad you said that, because it touches on a point that I really believe in too, that, like, you know, you can't look at a younger generation and like judge them for their decisions, like, and say things like, oh, of course they're gonna, you know, do this because they're entitled, or like they don't know what work is like. I don't think you can make those kind of assumptions, first of all, about someone who is younger than you. And like, who are you to like pick on someone who is younger than you? Like, pick on someone your own size, you know? But leave the Gen Zers alone, because they're gonna surpass us in so many ways, I believe. And also, like, I also believe that they do struggle, and it should be in our best interest, and we should be motivated to help them when we see a gap and when we know someone personally who is of that generation. That's our responsibility.
Yeah, and I think the most valuable thing we have to offer them in that moment is community. Like, this is a generation who has gone online because it's what they're used to, it's what they're comfortable with, but it's not what they need. Like, they report being lonely way more than any other age group. And so I think the call for churches is to provide that community from, you know, things that are more established, like youth groups and college ministries, but also into young adulthood. Like, that's a significant time where Gen Z is leaving the church too. And so I think more so than trying to provide kind of that hook in other areas, I think community is the hook. Like, it's hard to find these in-person places where you have like-minded folks who care about you, who want to go through life alongside you. Like, I think that's the attraction of online community, but we're seeing that it's not meeting all of the needs. And so I think the way that we can bring people into the church and, you know, expose them to all the other great benefits is starting with, this is a community. You can show up every Sunday, you can show up once a week for a small group, we have hangouts, we have all these things, and like, you can really bring them into a community that cares, that meets those like immediate needs of just having people around you who care about you. And then you can get into all of the added benefits of actually like living a life of faith. But I think it starts with community. Community
is, I think, safety for Gen Zers, and not just online community, but in-person community is very much needed by them and by all of us. But I mean, imagine yourself at a younger age with less resources, less knowledge, right? Shouldn't we be providing more for this generation? So if you're part of a church and you see this sort of discrepancy, I would just encourage you to have the courage to say something to a pastor or to a leader, in just that you notice that. And maybe you haven't noticed it until listening to this episode, but I think we have to be the voices in order to retain the younger people. And are they going to take over the church? Well, I hope so, because at this rate, they're leaving the church.
Yeah, and I feel like the most ringing endorsement we can provide to bring them in and to start changing that culture is the personal testimony. Like, going to someone you know, whether it's a friend, a family member, a coworker, like whoever is young and you know that they're looking for that thing that's missing from their lives, like your personal endorsement that, look, this is somewhere that I found salvation, I found community, I found all these great things. Like I think that being, what people would say chronically online does is it kind of drives us away from that personal connection, and we continue to seek relationship and seek belonging more and more, but you can find that online, but it doesn't fit that like deep-seated belonging in your heart of like, this is where I'm supposed to be, this is where I'm called to. And so I think just on a personal level, being able to provide that opportunity to someone and invite them personally is the absolute best way that we can bring people into the church.
Yeah, it definitely does fill in something that, a virtual group cannot. I definitely agree with that. And if you are a Gen Zer and you're a listener of this episode or of this podcast, like, we're not by any means like singling you out as being different. Like, we do have Gen Zers, millennials who listen, and that is the primary group of listeners that we have. But we do have encouragements for you too, after hearing all of this about your group. So Timothy 4:12, don't let anyone look down on you because you're young. Set an example for the believers in speech, conduct, love, faith, and purity. So if you can think of a way to change the church or the group that you're in that would just make it more suited to you, I would just encourage you to take that step and say the words that need to be said to whoever has the power or authority, and let yourself be heard, and don't be afraid of that. Just because you're young doesn't mean you don't have good ideas. You do have good ideas, and you can do that in your words and the actions that you want to take to bring new people in, or even just marketing styles that you envision, even creating TikToks or a TikTok account for your youth group. I think that's like been a great idea that I've seen in passing.
I love that. Like, you are never too young to set an example. And I think more so than ever, there's like this big generational gap where young people look at the advice older people say and, their response is, oh, that doesn't connect with me. Like, you don't live my reality. You don't see things the way I do. And so if you're a young person setting an example, that's who they will see. And they'll see that you're different, that you have this thing about you that just sets you apart. And I think that is what can open conversations. And it's hard to be a quote unquote leader at a young age, but it's never too early to be an example and to be that person who stands out a little bit.
Yeah. And as we wait for all these new things to happen, God willing, I pray for this generation to change the church in the best way possible. 2 Corinthians 5:17 says, if there be anyone in Christ, they are a new creation. Old things are gone, new things are all things. So everything is becoming new, and change is tough for a lot of people. Like, I totally understand that. Some people don't want their churches to change, especially older generations. Like, let's be honest, right? The infamous boomers. But it's a good thing. And the Bible says that new is good. And I think that the Bible was written in a way for people to be a people of progressive change. And when the earlier we learn that, the better it is for us later down the road. We don't want to be an old dog that you can't teach new tricks to, right? That's not who Jesus created us to be. He's constantly changing our lives. So I'm excited, and this is just my prayer for the church and for the next generation.
It's definitely an exciting time, and it also shouldn't be a scary time. Like, to kind of add on to that, but go in a slightly different direction, is the Bible also says that there's nothing new under the sun. Like, this isn't some giant scary change where people aren't going to be able to relate the same way. Like, I think we really look at younger generations, and like even I said earlier, oh, they're chronically online, and people think that's going to break society and people are going to turn away from Christ by the hundreds of thousands. Like, there truly is nothing new that God hasn't seen before. This is sure a new way of seeing it through technology and through these different things, but we can still drive forward so much progress and still do so much good for God's glory. It's really an exciting time. And I think a lot of this kind of goes into like Jocelyn and I's personal testimony of how we really found community too, is as soon as we graduated college, we were looking for that young adult community. And that was a real gap that we saw. It was hard to transition from a college ministry where it was really focused on our age group and where we're at in life. And then afterwards, it felt like we were dumped into a church full of parents and elderly people and all these people who had different stages of life, and there wasn't anything specifically for us or for our age group. And finding a young adult community was one of the biggest blessings that we've experienced. Like I was just talking about this last night with friends, that I wouldn't be where I'm at in faith. I wouldn't have met Jocelyn. Like my life would look completely different if there weren't people stepping in for young adults and saying, there is a need here, we need to provide.
Yeah, that's awesome. And I am also thankful for having a group, and it definitely is a blessing that we shouldn't take for granted. And it's amazing how many resources are out there for people who don't yet have a group, including you as a listener. If a church culture is something that you are just excited to learn more about and this episode spoke to you in some way, check out episode 32 as well. It's about being part of a cult church. We talk a lot more there. If you think Gen Z is bad, well, it could get worse. So listen to that episode. Gen Z is not the enemy. And leave us a rating and a review, because we recently got officially the right amount to show a review on Spotify. So that's super exciting. So please add to those numbers. Thanks for listening, guys.
See you next week.